Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work, which really started originally thinking about the conversation that we're having. If you go back to 2014, August 9th, 2014, when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, you had a national conversation around police violence. And in those early days and weeks and months of this conversation around racial justice and policing, there was very little data to inform that conversation. We learned very quickly. Articles in like 538.com, the New York Times, other publications would try to find some estimate of how many people were being killed by the police, how many people are harmed by the police in other ways. And the only data they were able to find was either the federal statistics, which included a drastic undercount of the number of people killed by the police and very little data on other forms of police violence, or available crowdsourced databases. At the time, there was killedbypolice.net, fatalencounters.org, which were literally these two independent groups of people who just got up every day and set a system of Google alerts up to track every article that had keywords like officer involved shooting, police killing, and began to log a public spreadsheet they would update every day or two with just a list of people who had been killed by police and a link to the article at that time back in 2014. At that time, we had very little data to actually be able to use data as a tool to push back against police violence, to demonstrate the level of racial disparity and inequity in policing, and more importantly, to use that data to understand better what solutions can actually work to keep communities safe from police violence. And so that was the work that I got involved in doing. It was looking at the available data and combining these independent databases that had sort of pieces of the puzzle, a log of links of articles. In some cases, they had information by race, gender, et cetera, other details of each incident. But at the time, about 40% of the records weren't coded by race. None of those databases had been merged. And the federal database, even to this day, the federal government does not have comprehensive data on people killed by the police. So if we waited on the federal government to get this data, we would still be waiting today. And we knew that we couldn't wait. And so at that time, I built Mapping Police Violence, which is a database that combines available sources, combines information from public records requests, from media articles, from existing state and federal databases that we know those databases are incomplete, which is why we need the other sources, from obituaries and other information that we can find online to compile the most comprehensive accounting of police violence, fatal police violence in this country. So I'm going to present a little bit about what has been learned, what we can actually use the data to understand about police violence and also to better understand about the solutions. So this is what we launched with back in 2015, about March or April of 2015. This is an accounting of everybody who was killed by the police that we were able to document in 2014. About 1,200 people killed by police that year. Now, since then, that data has continued to be collected, maintained, updated, and expanded in terms of its detail. And what we've learned over that time is that police violence has been fairly stable in severity in terms of fatal police violence year over year. So currently there's data going all the way back to 2013 through the present. And each year, about 1,100 to 1,200 people are killed by the police. So this is not something that, in 2014, when the national conversation really began to pay attention to police violence, it wasn't because there was an increase in the level of police violence, but rather there's been a stable amount of police violence year over year. And you can see that year over year, you can see that month over month, you can even see that day over day. So this is 2021 through October. Currently, actually, we've tracked 923 people who've been killed by the police this year. There have only been 12 days in which the police did not kill anybody. So that's the sort of top line, how many people are impacted by fatal police violence. Now, since then, we've been able to collect data on additional forms of police violence as well. So non-fatal police shootings, use of force, other use of force incidents. And so what you see is that for every one person who is fatally shot by the police, an estimated 2 people are shot and survive. So again, if about 1,100 people are killed by police each year, that suggests that there are about 3,300 people who are shot by police each year. And an even larger number, according to public health data, about 55,000 people are hospitalized or injured due to police use of force each year. So this is a massive, massive issue in scale. We're sort of examining the data that we can get, which is Oftentimes the data that's most likely to be reported, data on fatal police violence, police shootings, and the most serious types of force. But this is certainly something that impacts a much larger number of people and families and communities, which we'll get into in a second. So in terms of racial disparity, consistently year over year, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police per population than white people. Latinos are about 1.5 times more likely to be killed by the police, and Black and brown people are more likely to be unarmed when killed by the police. Indigenous populations, depending on the year, are either the group most likely to be killed by police or second most likely to be killed by the police. And there's a whole host of reasons why we believe there's underreporting of Native Americans who are killed by the police, particularly because in most of these cases, we're dependent on local media reports, information obtained from agencies, and in much more rural areas where there's less of a media infrastructure, it might be less likely for those incidents to be reported and collected in the database. Now, diving into these racial disparities, overall, the average is a three times disparity between Black and white people in terms of being killed by the police. But when you break that down by city, so these are the 50 largest cities in the country, you can see how widespread the racial disparity in police violence is. In 47 of the 50 largest cities in America, from 2013 through 2020, Black people were more likely to be killed by police than white people. Only 3 cities that wasn't the case, and in all 3 of those cities, Latinos were killed by police at higher rates than white people. So there's not a city of the 50 largest cities in the country that doesn't have a racial disparity against either Black or brown people. And that's what we see, is that this is the rule and not the exception. The inequities are sort of baked into the system, but they differ in terms of severity. So in Chicago and Minneapolis, Black people are about 22 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. In other cities, that's less of a disparity, but there's still almost always a disparity there. Also wanted to understand, what happens after somebody is killed by the police? Do the officers ever get held accountable? Are they prosecuted? Are they disciplined? And so in many cases, it's extremely difficult to get information on officers who've been disciplined or fired. In the majority of states, there are restrictions on getting access to an officer's personnel file, which is their disciplinary history. But we do have data on officers that are charged with a crime after killing somebody. And in 98.3% of cases in which somebody is killed by the police, no officers are charged with a crime. And in fewer than 1% of cases, officers are convicted of a crime. And when convicted, they get a lesser sentence than civilians who are convicted of the same crimes. So by and large, in almost every incident, there's no criminal justice system response to the officers in terms of holding them accountable. So what else can we learn about this? This is sort of a national landscape, but you also see this variation by state. So each state, you can see the rate of police violence overall per capita and the rate for Black people in particular. Again, just like at the city level, you see a disparity in almost every state, but those disparities differ in severity. When you look at the rates of police violence per city for the 100 largest cities, you see a huge difference between cities like St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Spokane, Phoenix, Tulsa, San Bernardino, Orlando, Florida, where I'm from, and other cities that have much lower rates of police violence like Irvine, Lincoln, Chesapeake, Lexington. And so there are some cities that have much higher rates than other cities. And part of the work over the past 6 or 7 years has been to unpack that data and understand what are the factors associated with places that have lower rates of police violence than other places. What has been effective in terms of policy, practice, and other changes to actually reduce the rate of police violence over time? And how do we scale what works across the country to save lives? That is like how we use the data to make a difference. Now, that is something that is incredibly granular. You have to get to better understand the patterns of police violence over time. And I think over the past several years, the science has evolved on this as well, which is fascinating. So now we're able to get data, and a number of organizations like the Invisible Institute and others have been able to get access to very detailed, personally identifiable, like they identify as the officers, data for some of the largest police departments in the country, the ones in states that don't have those restrictions on personnel files. So this is Columbus, for example, Columbus, Ohio police use of force per officer. So going from like the macro level down to the micro level within department, the officer level, you can see the same disparities here, where there are officers that have much higher numbers of use of force incidents than other officers. The average officer only had, the average officer had maybe 1, 2, or 3 use of force incidents. These officers had 190, 130, 107 use of force incidents. And in the red are all of the cases in which no officers were disciplined for those incidents. So just like in the chart nationwide around officers prosecuted, here you can see almost no officers are disciplined for using force, even the officers that have used force over 100 times. And almost zero officers had been charged, suspended, or terminated. The only officer who was terminated was an officer after he had killed a second person in the police department, was finally terminated from that department. But looking at these patterns, it was actually predictable that he would be one of those officers, given he was on this end of the spectrum. Now, what you'll also notice in this chart is on the far left, it says purge IAB, which means purge by the Internal Affairs Board. Now, there are over 3,000 use of force incidents that don't have an officer name associated with them because that information has been purged from the records as a requirement because the city signed a police union contract requiring them to delete those records after a certain amount of time. So part of what you see here is the value in getting access to this data because the system is trying to erase the evidence of their own officers' misconduct on a regular schedule. And that is articulated in police union contracts and other record retention requirements. And so it becomes difficult to even establish these patterns for particular officers or particular departments or units when much of the data is being purged year after year. So these are policy issues, right? You can see here a chart of officers these are police shootings overall, both fatal and non-fatal, for a list of 7 cities where such data is available. And what this analysis finds is that a huge proportion of officers who shoot people have shot people before. And again, these are patterns that can be established in the data that can inform interventions to remove those officers from the force before they engage in further violence. Okay, so that's going from the macro to the micro. I want to address false narratives because I think it's important to think about, we can talk about the problem all day, but to move solutions, one, we have to be able to get past some of the narratives that have entrenched and sustained the system as it is operated to date. And a key narrative that has sustained that system is a narrative about crime. This idea that the police are using so much force, even deadly force, even disproportionately in Black communities, because they're simply engaging with violent individuals in violent communities. That's the narrative that the police propose. Now, that narrative traces all the way back to slavery. It is a white supremacist narrative. It also turns out that when we break down the actual data, you can see that there's a lot of variation here, where many of the cities that have much higher rates of police violence don't have high rates of violent crime, and vice versa. In fact, some of the cities that have among the lowest rates of fatal police violence also have some of the highest rates of violent crime, places like Detroit and Newark. So again, this is something to think about, how we can use data to push back against some of these narratives, because those are the narratives that often sustain and continue to result in more funding being given to this policing system. So this, for example, is a chart of cities with the highest violent crime rates in the country, and the chart is the rate of fatal police violence per capita in those cities. So again, these are cities with high violent crime rates, reported violent crime rates. And again, you see that the rate of police violence varies substantially. So a city, could be anywhere along this range, but again, many of those cities are not. Now, what actually we learn when we look at the data is that much of these incidents don't derive from any reported or alleged act of violence. They derive from the police responding and intervening in people's lives for a host of low-level issues and low-level situations that aren't necessarily even crimes. So folks having a mental health crisis, folks who are stopped in traffic for equipment violations like having tinted windows, folks who are stopped there's no alleged offense at all, but they're just stopped merely for quote, looking suspicious. In fact, what we find is that 2/3 of cases in which people are killed by the police, at least 2/3, based on the available information by police reports from media sources, which themselves bake in a bit of bias that we need to account for. Even then, about 2/3 of these cases involve nonviolent issues, nonviolent offenses, where we can think of a whole host of alternative responses immediately to prevent those incidents from happening in the first place. So traffic stops, there are communities that are beginning to, like in Berkeley, that are beginning to experiment with alternative responses to traffic enforcement. In Philadelphia, they just banned police from stopping people for equipment violations. Mental health response, we're seeing crisis intervention teams of unarmed psychiatrists and therapists responding to folks in mental health crisis in a number of cities, like in Portland, in Eugene, Oregon. They're starting to pilot that in places like New York City. So again, like this helps us think differently about the scale of the solution, how many people might be impacted by particular types of interventions and alternatives that can help us think differently about policy and practice in our advocacy. Now, another narrative, the Ferguson effect narrative. You've probably heard this. This is actually the original narrative that we're hearing again about crime and, in the right wing, actually not even right wing now, even among some Democrats, we're seeing this idea that, violent crime is increasing, even though when we look at the data, homicides and gun violence has increased. Other types of crime actually have not. But again, we're seeing this narrative that somehow the police are not being aggressive enough in addressing crime and need even more funding, even more money in order to do that. Now, that is not a data-informed perspective. So when we actually look at the data, right, this is the change in arrests over time. So this narrative suggests that the police have to continue aggressively engaging in enforcement, have to continue arresting large numbers of people, particularly in Black and brown communities, in order to prevent violent crime from getting out of control and other crimes from getting out of control. That's the narrative. Now, when we look at the actual data, what we see is that in big cities in particular, among the largest cities in the country, we've seen a reduction in arrests for low-level offenses since about 2013. And it's a pretty substantial reduction in arrests for particular types of offenses like disorderly conduct, sex work, drunkenness, curfew and loitering, and a number of things, drug use, a number of things that are often proxies for this style of broken windows policing that was started by the New York Police Department and then spread across the country, that was about arresting a lot of people for low-level issues. Now police departments are starting to move away from that. Cities are starting to move away from that after they've adopted various policy changes. They've decriminalized marijuana in many places. They've begun to shift in a different direction with regard to reducing the overall number of people arrested, particularly for these low-level issues. And what we also see is in the places that have done that, they actually have seen a larger reduction in crime, a larger reduction in violent crime. Murder rates went up more in the places that increased low-level arrests versus decreased them. And we saw a huge reduction in police shootings in cities that reduced low-level arrests. So as they were not arresting so many people for these low-level offenses, that as we see result in and comprise a huge proportion of overall killings by the police, overall deadly police force reduced in those cities. And it did not increase crime like the narrative presumed. So again, this is information that is important for how we can engage with advocates, engage with policymakers, and use the data to actually move policies that further reduce the size and scope of the policing system, reduce the amount of funding that it receives, and support the scaling up of alternatives that don't result in harm and death for individuals. And part of what you also see here in the data is that some of those shifts in cities, in more urban areas, places that have been a little bit more willing to engage in shifting their thinking around approaching low-level offenses, around the broader carceral state, around drug use, et cetera. Some of those places have actually begun to change such that we see a huge trend in the reduction of police killings in urban areas relative to suburban and rural areas over time. Now there are more people killed in rural areas than in urban areas. And that is something that is new. So we're actually seeing a shift as rural areas continue to stagnate, continue not to implement the types of changes that advocates have been pushing for. In fact, going the opposite way with the backlash. We see that reflected in the data as well, in terms of an increase in those communities. So dismantling barriers to accountability. So talked about the problem, talked about some of the narratives that sustain that problem year after year, day after day, month after month, like clockwork, about 3 people killed by police each day. But there are policy, practice, and structural changes that can make a real difference here. So looking back at the data on Columbus use of force, it should not be allowable for police departments, first and foremost, as a basic thing, to purge the evidence of their own officers' misconduct. Like as a data practice, as a general accountability and transparency practice, that should be obvious. And yet baked into the majority of cities' police union contracts they have these schedules of erasing, purging, or restricting the use of that information to actually result in any type of accountability. So that ought to change. Number two, when we see the data on officers who do get disciplined, so it's rare enough for them to get disciplined. When they do, they're often reinstated because of those same contracts. Those contracts include clauses that allow officers to appeal those decisions to an arbitrator who's a lawyer that they help select, who has full discretion to reinstate them in the majority of cities. And so you can see in the data that a huge proportion of officers, in some cases the majority, are reinstated after they're fired, which leads to fewer officers being disciplined in the first place because of this process that will just result in them getting reinstated anyway. So police unions, we know we have to take on the police unions. They're like the key lobbying group and sort of public force that has tried to obstruct and block change from happening. And that's baked into the contracts at the structural and systemic level with cities. It's baked into the lobbying and the power that they have with donating to legislators and advocating for state policies that are harmful to communities or that blocking legislation that would actually create alternatives to policing. So that we have to take on the police unions. We have to remove those structures that allow them to continue to organize to further entrench the power of the police. The other thing is we have to be able to build off of and build an evidence basis around what works as cities and states begin to implement changes. So we've seen changes happen in some places, not everywhere, over the past several years as a result of historic organizing, movement activity, advocacy that has done things that have never been done before. For example, Maryland this past year just repealed its Police Bill of Rights law. The first state to ever do that. There's still 20 states that have such laws. These laws create special protections for the police that prevent them from being held accountable. In Austin, organizers successfully defeated the police union contract there by unanimous vote. In Berkeley, as I said, they're creating alternatives to traffic enforcement. In Denver, they have crisis intervention teams that are unarmed responders that are alternatives to a police response. In Baltimore, they've stopped prosecuting low-level crimes. And even the police sometimes now are reporting data that is showing that these programs work. So in LA County, the Sheriff's Department issues an annual report on the success or the effectiveness of the crisis intervention program there. So this is called the Mental Health Evaluation Team. It's an unarmed crisis intervention responder. The police usually play backup, which is not ideal. The Denver model, in my view, is better. But even in that situation, they report, the Sheriff's Department reports that they would have killed 9 people if not for the crisis intervention specialists being on the scene to de-escalate the situation. And they report being willing to use force against over 600 people, if not for that crisis intervention specialist de-escalating. So the police themselves are now reporting that these programs are effective. There's a lot of evidence growing around the programs that are being piloted today. And part of the work is also to build that evidence, sustain that work as it is beginning to actually make a difference in addressing police violence. And you do see some big changes in some places. So in Philadelphia, this is a week-over-week chart of arrests. Now this was as the lockdown was occurring last year, the Philadelphia Police Department announced that they would just stop arresting people for low-level offenses. They didn't want their officers exposing other people potentially to coronavirus and vice versa. They decided they would stop doing that just by the police chief or police commissioner just decided that. And you know what? They actually did. So you see week over week, a huge decline in arrests for low-level offenses. Arrests for violent offenses remained relatively stable. You had other issues that they were still responding to, but the vast majority of arrests, again, only 5% of all arrests nationwide are for violent crimes. So they just cut off a huge proportion of the overall sort of dragnet of the carceral state and its exposure to the public. And that could happen within a week. They could make a decision to make a huge difference here if they wanted to, if they were pushed to actually move quickly. In other places, you see huge reductions in police shootings and use of force as a result of changes to the accountability structure. So you see in places like Oakland, an over 90% reduction in police shootings because of a set of changes that were implemented in that city. You have the beginning of a crisis intervention mental health alternative to the police. You have changes that reduced the amount of contact over drug offenses, so decriminalizing, in many cases, marijuana and other issues. You had the implementation of a DOJ consent decree, a DOJ lawsuit that required them to implement a certain number of changes to their accountability system. They now have one of the only civilian oversight boards that has the power to fire an officer in the entire country. And you see a huge change in use of force and police shootings in many cases in cities that implement some of these interventions. So this is like preliminary data that's continuing to be built as we're seeing changes in particular cities, particular states that can hopefully be scalable to other places. So I'll close by just saying, this is a beginning and not an end. Like if we go back to 2014, when mapping police violence first started, there was almost no data, there was no analysis. What existed was limited to a handful of academic studies and a handful of cities relying on impartial or incomplete data from the federal government. And now we have data that, according to best research estimates, covers about 95% of the total number of people killed by police nationwide. And now are collecting data on other forms of police violence as well, non-fatal force, police shootings, racial disparities in arrests, what those arrests were for, accountability, et cetera, police budgets, and baking all that into a better system for evaluating changes in cities over time and tracking what works. And that's the Police Scorecard project at policescorecard.org. So I'll sort of pause there. That's the data. And I'm happy to dive into any aspect that you want to talk about.
Really good presentation. So if anyone has any questions, you can either unmute yourselves or you can enter into the chat. There is one question that was already put into the chat. So Gabrielle had said, you mentioned that the database you are using is software that pulls a collection of data relevant online. Is this code or data that's public access for us to use as well? If so, where can we obtain the data collection that you use to produce all these plots?
Yeah, great question. So the data is all public. You can download the database at mappingpoliceviolence.org. And then, so all of the charts, et cetera, on the site are built off of that data. And happy, like if you're interested in collaborating, happy to work with you on like visualizing particular aspects. I should say that there's so much that we're still learning about how police violence impacts communities, what solutions can look like. So, for example, researchers use the Mapping Police Violence database at Boston University to find that there was a population level impact on Black communities' mental health following police killings. And that the entire state, you could track a change in the mental health of Black communities in the entire state, in places where more Black people were being killed by the police. And so I think that there are a range of different ways that we could think about better exploring, tracking, and researching the impacts of police violence across the country. And happy to work with you to do that.
How long did it take you from the point of ideation to getting to your first version of this that you put out in public?
Yeah, so it was probably 5 months, I'm going to say, between. So essentially what happened that was like a spark for me was there was an article that I read in 538 that talked about that the federal government wasn't doing a good job collecting the data, but that there was a way to find the data, and they audited the killbypolice.net database and found that 100% of those links checked out. And then what they also did separately, the Human Rights Data Analysis Group did an analysis around that time that showed that there are about 1,200 people killed by police each year. So they did a multiple systems analysis by analyzing the existing incomplete federal databases and the level of overlap between them. They came up with overall estimates of like what was missing in their data. And it turned out that between the Killed by Police database and the Fatal Encounters database, there were about 1,200 records between them. And so their methodology that was just like a system of Google alerts to find these articles tagged to keywords actually ended up being an effective methodology in finding almost all of these records. And so that was like okay, well, there's just this spreadsheet, but like we need to use this data to figure out like, we need to do something with this data because like this is a real issue that impacts real people, and this data ought to be used to find solutions and advocate for them. So that was like the aha moment where I began just continuing to find these records, to code them, to build out sort of a schema of what we're going to track. So tracking by race, by information about the encounter type. So now tracking around, was it a traffic stop or et cetera. Tracking the officers. So now the officer names where they can be found are in the database. So whether they have a previous incident on their record, it's in the database where we can get that information, whether the officers were charged. So all of these things were sort of built into that, like the initial process of building out from this foundation, that I think really, hats off to, Brian Burkhart at Fatal Encounters. KillByPolice.net is no longer around. So like these groups, like, didn't get a lot of money, like didn't, this is what the federal government should be doing. They have all the resources in the world. They still have not. So it's like up to people like me, it's up to people like Brian Burkhart, and just like organizers, activists, like individual researchers that have like tried to find a way to do the government's job for it so that we can like move forward.
Thank you.
Excellent. There's also to the chat. Have you used a program like ARGIS to map the occurrence of killings? I know you mentioned hotspots recently.
So I haven't used ArcGIS. I have, so just to give you a sense, like the project was like built with like almost no resources. So I looked for like off-the-shelf solutions. Like I didn't have access to ArcGIS. I did have Carto, which is like a mapping software. So it's like a CSV file that like uploads to the mapping software, and then I'm able to visualize it through there. And then now there's a bunch more details. We have like census tract information, have a bunch of other geographic indicators. But like this was built with like Tableau on like a free trial version off of Carto for like $20 a month, like Squarespace to build a website for like $20 a month. And so like, don't doubt like what you can do without like a lot of money. At the same time, like, again, like this is work that ought to be supported and like that the government should be doing, and it's not, and we should like call that out too.
It's funny that I actually did some of the same thing. I was actually doing doing some policy analysis pre-grad school, but also not with a lot of money. So it's actually really funny that was also your method as well. And another question from Charles: are you doing impact studies of violence, people who've been beaten by police, who've been harassed, economic impact on people attacked by them, or police sexual abuse victims?
Great question. So I think the short answer is no, not enough research, and interested in collaborating to do some of that research. I think like economic impact, just to start with, I haven't seen a whole lot of research specific to police violence without including, I think most of it has been focused on like the impact of incarceration on economic outcomes. So not necessarily like police use of force, and usually that's not baked into the calculation, but it is a form of policing and like the broader analysis of the impact of the carceral state on folks. Economic prospects, the impact of having a record on your ability to get a job, for example, particularly for Black folks. So I think like a lot of the research is focused on the impact of the broader carceral system on folks' economic well-being. The other issue around like police sexual assault, police sexual abuse is it is extremely difficult to get access to that information as well. And it's extremely unlikely for it to be reported. And so that's where, and we can understand why that is when we look at the data. So when you look at the data nationwide on civilian complaints, only 1 in every 13 complaints of police misconduct gets upheld, which means substantiated. And an even smaller proportion results in any discipline against the officer. And then like discipline, as you saw with that Columbus chart, is a slap on the wrist. What often happens, and this speaks to the question around retaliation and harassment of folks who've already been impacted by policing, is that what often happens is the only thing that happens to the officer is that they get a record. As per the police union contract, they're required to get the name and the copy of the complaint of the person who complained against them. So that exposes that person to retaliation in many cases. And I'm not sure of any systemic study that has actually tracked that, but it would certainly be something that I'd be interested in collaborating to do.
Another question to the chat by T. How much work pressure has your work put on the authorities and federal, municipal government, and police departments to improve and increase their data collection efforts?
So that's a great question. And it depends what level of government. So I think federally, where I think most people have paid attention to, is that like federally, not too much has happened that is really useful in terms of data. So back in 2015 or so, James Comey, the FBI director at the time, announced that they would start collecting better data. They cited the fact that these crowdsourced databases existed. It was obvious there were more people killed by the police in their federal database. So the federal government should build a database of its own. And so they started this use of force data collection project that's housed at the FBI, which not the best or not an impartial agency, certainly to house that kind of information. And yet they are the agency that collects all of this other data from police and has no problem doing that, right? So they get arrest data from 18,000 or so agencies every single year, detailed arrest data. They have thousands of arrests across that data per agency. They get data on a host of other things, crime, number of officers on the police force, a whole host of things they actually get from these departments every single year. But when it comes to police use of force, what we've seen with their program is currently they only have 49% of the nation's law enforcement agencies participating in the program. And they adopted an internal rule under the Trump administration, which they still have, because remember, it's the same FBI director that they had under the Trump administration. That rule means that they would have prohibited the disclosure of individualized or agency level aggregated data until 80% of the nation's law enforcement agencies participate in the program. And so right now we're on 49%. That actually went down from 50-something% last year. So it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon, which means none of the data that's actually being collected is going to be made public, made useful to anyone anytime soon through the federal program. So whether it's intentional on their part to not hold the police accountable, it is the FBI, or whether it is they just, the police don't want to provide that data as well. It doesn't look like the federal government is willing or able to do that well. And so I think for that, it's important that we can keep pressuring them, but we have to continue to build the data infrastructure, recognizing that it's going to be a while before they actually come aboard.
I have a question, Sam. I have a question about any future analyses that you plan on doing.
Yeah, so there are a number of things that I'm working on and that I think should be the subject of further research, pending the resources to engage in all of these things at once. So I think first of all, continue to build off of building out evidence bases around what works with regard to alternatives to the police. And the interplay between places that have reduced police violence over time and the introduction of some of these alternatives. I think that's something that we ought to have data that we can use, when talking to state legislators, when talking to folks that hopefully will support the efficacy of some of these programs. I think the other piece is using some of the additional data on police use of force that now we've been able to collect to more sort of fully understand not only at the agency level, but at the predictive level, which cities year over year consistently have these patterns of misconduct and higher rates of police violence, larger racial disparities, so that can be used for sheriff's elections, for example, right? So you have counties where people vote on sheriffs and almost nobody's using data to inform whether there's more incarceration over that sheriff during that sheriff's term, whether the racial disparities have gotten worse. And so that actually they have a lot of discretion over the county jail system, which they generally operate in most places. And yet they are continuing to ratchet up incarceration rates, particularly in rural areas, in some suburban areas, and with no accountability. So how can we use the data more directly to impact who is elected, getting out some of the worst sheriffs in the country, et cetera. So I think that's a piece of it as well. And I'm sure a bunch of other things soon.